Where do you stand in terms of your metaphysical position? Somewhere in the interview, I heard that you started really as materialist. So you really took a path almost from one extreme to another. So where are you today, and how have you arrived at that?
I don't think I was ever a sincere materialist. I can remember when I was a student at Oxford University arguing with my tutor, a lovely man, when I was doing neuroscience, and arguing against the identity of consciousness and neural activity. But I still had a sneaking suspicion that I probably ultimately was a body, and in particular a brain. But I moved away from that position and into a position which I find quite difficult to define. I suppose I could best call it as a position of agnosticism. And that's true at the level of ontology, and it's true at the level of metaphysics. So I'm an ontological and metaphysical agnostic. I'm in a position of not knowing, and so I don't embrace materialism. I don't embrace dualism. I don't embrace idealism. And as for dualism, I don't embrace property dualism, which says that mind and matter are two aspects of some other substance. I don't embrace substance dualism, which says that mind and matter are distinct, most famously associated with Descartes. I have a position of, as I say, of metaphysical or ontological agnosticism. And I think there's a good reason for being an agnostic.
I'm just being devil's advocate. Isn't it a little bit defeatist? I can't know, we can't know, therefore I say I take the position I do not know.
There's no greater defeat than getting things wrong. And it seems to me if I embraced materialism, then definitely I would have got a lot of things wrong, and we can talk about the limitations of materialism. If I embraced dualism, likewise, I would run into all sorts of absurdities. So, yes, I do feel a bit disappointed that by the time I'm, getting towards the end of my life, I still don't understand what kind of creature I am or have been, and I'm not too sure what kind of stuffs or fundamental substances there are in the universe. Nonetheless, I can live with that better than embracing some entirely wrong ontological or metaphysical position. So there are defeats and there are big defeats, and I've embraced a defeat to avoid a big defeat.
So basically what you're saying, you never really were materialist. Why do you think materialism doesn't deliver?
Well, for many people, the crowning glory of materialism is the notion that the mind is essentially material activity in part of the body, namely the brain. That you and I, our consciousness is identical with neural activity. Now, there are some good reasons for thinking that. First of all, if you chop my head off, my intelligence quotient falls quite perceptibly. I'm not as bright as I was if you chop my head off. And we know also, and from my own work in neuroscience, that if the brain is damaged, there is a loss of aspects of conscious processing. And so it's clear that the brain is a necessary condition for consciousness and for those aspects of personality which we all have. But it isn't a sufficient condition. If you look at neural activity, there's nothing in it that really gives any justification for believing that it is identical with consciousness. You look at what happens in the brain. All the stuff that goes on in the brain is homogeneous. Most neural activity looks like other neural activity. And what's most interesting is that neural activity in the parts of the brain that are supposed to be associated with consciousness, like the cerebral cortex, is very similar to neural activity in the parts of the brain that aren't associated with consciousness, like the brainstem or the spinal cord. So there's nothing in neural activity which would explain the rich, complicated variousness of the world that's delivered to our perceptions, recollected our memories, and argued over in thought. So there's very good reason for saying, well, that's very odd. If neural activity was identical with perception, isn't it strange how utterly different it is from perception? It's expressed quite nicely by Colin McGinn, who said basically that we have no understanding of how the water of neural activity becomes the wine of consciousness. So there are lots of good reasons for thinking that we cannot reduce consciousness to physical activity in the brain. And that was the most, as it were, plausible, promising candidate for a material basis of consciousness. clearly you're not going to find the material basis of consciousness outside the brain, in sticks and stones and so on. So that's why I'm not a materialist, because one of the striking things about consciousness is that it is about something other than itself. So, for example, I'm seeing you, so I have a visual experience. My visual experience is about something other than myself. It's about you. The technical term for that in philosophy is that my experiences have intentionality. They have aboutness. Now, clearly, there is nothing in the material world that has this aboutness. A neural discharge is a neural discharge. End of story. So those are some of the reasons why I'm not at all persuaded that the brain is a necessary and sufficient condition of consciousness, or that consciousness is activity in the brain. Yes, for reasons that escape us all, the brain is a necessary condition of consciousness. So if you damage the brain, you lose consciousness, or may lose it. But beyond that, I don't think we can, as it were, situate consciousness in the brain.
You're, of course, a neuroscientist and a medical doctor, apart from being a philosopher these days. But if I listen to mainstream psychiatrists, neuroscientists, they deny existence of consciousness altogether. So you do not deny that consciousness exists because you use this term, right?
Absolutely. And basically, there are quite a lot of English-speaking philosophers who would argue that. There's Keith Frankish, who says that the belief we have consciousness is an illusion. But actually, having an illusion is a mode of consciousness. So, you cannot be deceived into believing you have consciousness, because in order to believe you have consciousness, you have to be conscious. So I'm sorry to say, one thing you can't deny is consciousness. And that's really has some connections with the most famous thought experiment in the whole of philosophy, which is Descartes' cogito experiment. He says, I can't be sure of anything. Well, hang on a moment. There's one thing I can be sure of. It's that I'm not sure of things. That is to say, I am thinking about whether or not things exist. So I actually cannot deny that I'm thinking, or I cannot deny that I'm doubting. I may doubt something, but I cannot deny that I'm doubting. So obviously, Descartes took that a bit further and said, if I think, therefore I must be. And we can look at that perhaps critically. But for people like Frankish and other English-speaking philosophers, it seems to me, I just can't understand how they can deny consciousness, because they have to be conscious to deny it. They have to have complicated consciousness. They have to have consciousness of words, of arguments, and of me who's arguing with them. Without all that consciousness, you couldn't argue about the presence or absence, the reality or otherwise of consciousness.
How would you explain consciousness? What it is, if you have to explain to a child, let's say, in the simplest terms, what would you say consciousness is?
I think I can describe what I mean by consciousness, but I don't think I can explain where consciousness sits in the universe. But let's look at an attempt to describe it. It seems to me it's composed of things at many levels. For example, there's my awareness of the color of the books in the background as I'm talking. So that's some basic perceptual consciousness. Then there is consciousness of pure sensations, as when I've got pain or itch. All that's perfectly respectable consciousness. And then there's more complex consciousness. There's our memories of things that happened to us in the past. There are thoughts about things, when we entertain thoughts and so on. And then there are memories of facts. So there's many components of consciousness. So it isn't just one simple thing, it's a multitude of things. And again, that's another good reason for doubting whether brain activity can explain consciousness, because we have such a variety, not only of conscious contents, but of types and levels of consciousness. There's such a profound difference between my awareness of the red color of a book that I can see behind me, on the one hand, and my thinking about whether or not Paris is the capital of France. Both of those are perfectly respectable elements of consciousness, but clearly they're profoundly different. So there you are. That's conscious. It's a mishmash of things, but they have something in common, which is that they are about something other than themselves. So my experience of red is about that book over there, which is other than me, other than my experience. My thought about Paris is other than my thought. I'm thinking about Paris, but clearly there is a distance, metaphorically, between my thought and Paris.
Yeah, defining consciousness is a difficult task, I think. I was trying to find a good definition. I couldn't. Nobody can give a definition.
But it's an untidy business, consciousness. You know, it's composed of all sorts of things. But you can, by describing what we'd all recognize as consciousness, or elements of consciousness, I mean, that's all we need to do, really. We just need to agree that there are such things as sensations, perceptions, memories, thoughts, and so on.
Do you think consciousness really resides individually in everybody, and it also exists as a sort of what they call it, a universal field of consciousness?
That's such an interesting question. And it's also, this is a very, very popular view amongst otherwise sane philosophers at the moment. I have absolutely no doubt that consciousness, although it's not located in my brain, is certainly located in me. It is, as it were, anchored in a subject, an embodied subject in my case. But there are many philosophers who argue that, in fact, consciousness isn't really, it's consciousness everywhere. And I guess you were alluding to panpsychism. And the panpsychist argument is quite an interesting one. What it says as follows: you know, science seems to suggest that the world just consists of material objects. But actually, science doesn't give us the intrinsic nature of things. When we do science, we see things interacting with other things. We see what things do, not what they are. We see them from the outside, and we can only work out what they do, not what they are. There's one exception to that, and that is our own brains, so the panpsychists say, and the one object that I know from within, so I can sneak round the back of the veil of appearance, the one object I know from within is my brain. And that brain is conscious, from which I can conclude that when you get inside things, when you get to their intrinsic nature, they are conscious. And so consciousness is everywhere. It's not an argument, I have to say, that convinces me at all. First of all, if consciousness was everywhere, it's rather strange, even so, that some things seem to be conscious rather than others, that we are inclined to ascribe consciousness to people like yourself and me, and not to stones or to rocks and so on. And the second thing is, well, there's clearly something special about a conscious subject, that she or he can access themselves in virtue of saying, I am this. And so the question of then consciousness, or the origin of consciousness, becomes a question of, what is the origin of first-person being? How is it true of some things that am is true of them? So I am this body, and you can say of yourself, I am your body. Whereas we wouldn't ascribe that to pebbles and trees and bacteria and so on and so forth. But the point about panpsychism is the claim that because you know one object from within, namely your own brain, and that object is conscious, it's reasonable to infer that all objects, when seen from within, are conscious. And that seems to me a completely bonkers extrapolation from one's own experience to the totality of the universe. But panpsychists, I mean, they're very honest people, and they will say, well, this is what we believe, and so we're obliged to think that electrons have a smidgen of consciousness, and so on and so forth. And they get themselves into a real muddle, working out how all those little smidgens of consciousness add up when it comes to something like Raymond Tallis. You know, are all the electrons gabbing away there, shattering away, and we've got a complete pandemonium inside me of these little smidgens of consciousness. But don't get me started on panpsychism.
You were referring somewhere in one of your interviews as shared consciousness, and that, for me, sort of rang a little bit this filter theory story, that there is a sort of a one unified field, and the purpose of our brains is to filter down this consciousness into individual experience. So in a way, we share consciousness, but we still have an individual experience of it.
Yes, I mean, the way I feel we share consciousness is not quite as fundamental and as profound as you've described, as if we're all, as it were, dipping into the same lake. For me, we share consciousness, yes, as we are sharing consciousness now. I mean, sharing of consciousness is extraordinarily well developed in human beings. It begins with pointing, when a little baby points out something to us and we share what it's seeing. It continues with very simple language and so on and so forth. It's there in exchange of gazes, etc. That's the kind of shared consciousness I'm thinking of. I wasn't thinking of anything more profound, universal, and generalized as that, as what you've just described. I also think that the world, in a way, the human world, has indeed been woven out of lots of moments of shared consciousness. There is this fabric of shared intentionality, collective intentionality, and so on. But that's not the same as it were, a field of free-floating consciousness from which we all drink, as it were. I'm not too sure I accept that view.
So we have complete free will?
I don't think we do. I didn't choose to be born. 1946, I was happily non-existent. I didn't say, oh, about time I existed, looked at my watch and decided to come into being. Clearly, I haven't chosen my beginning, and I fear that I may not choose my end. But it seems to me, within certain constraints, we have genuine free will. But there are, of course, many different levels of constraint. There may be the constraints of political oppression, disability, loss of consciousness, and so on and so forth. But within those constraints, we do indeed have free will. And it's surprising one has to argue that, because most of us recognize the difference between something that merely happens to us and something that we do. So, for example, there is a difference between me falling down the stairs when I've lost consciousness, which is something that happens to me, or on the other hand, it hasn't happened yet, but it could well do, or on the other hand, me walking down the stairs on my way to go to London to attend a meeting where I will make a case for stroke services to be improved for the people of Britain. Now, you can see there's a complete difference of the same physical event, pretty well the same physical event. In one case, it is purely a physical event. In the other case, it is something that I do. So that I think most people would agree there's a difference between doing and happening. But the reason why they find it difficult to believe what's in front of their own eyes are one or two arguments about actions. Actions, they will say, are physical events. All physical events have causes. Those causes have causes. And so the causal ancestry extends right back to before you and I were born. So if my actions are physical events that have an ancestry before I was born, how can I be responsible for them? That's whammy number one. The other whammy is the laws of nature, which says essentially that everything that happens according to the laws of nature. You can't buck the laws of nature. So basically the processes that brought you into being and the processes by which you walk down the stairs in order to catch a train, in order to go to London, to make a case for stroke services, a very voluntary activity. So basically they're both in the grip of the laws of nature. So we're in real trouble. And it's worse, actually, because people would say, well, actually, if the laws of nature didn't apply universally, you wouldn't be able to do anything. You wouldn't be able to predict its outcome. I mean, I couldn't get up in the morning out of bed if action and reaction were not equal and opposite. The process of pressing on the mattress gets me out of the bed. Nor could I walk to the shops to collect my breakfast, which again depends on action and reaction being equal opposite. So people say, look, how can you sort of depend on the laws of nature and depend on causal connectedness, at the same time deny, or as it were, set it aside when you want to claim that you're free? And I think we need to sort of step back. We need to step back looking very critically at the idea of causal connectedness. And even more, and perhaps more interesting, you need to step back and look at the laws of nature. When people think about the laws of nature, they usually tend to think of very sort of complicated ones, quantum mechanics and general relativity, all that sort of thing. But let's think of the one we all learnt about in school, Boyle's law. This is a law that says if you increase the pressure on a gas and you double the pressure, you'll halve its volume. Classic law. Now, the interesting thing about that law is that it was discovered by a chap called Boyle in the 1660s. So in other words, he was sufficiently distant from nature in order to discover the habits that nature has. And I use the word habit advisedly because the word laws of nature implies that things in nature that have legislative, mandatory power. But what nature has is habits. And there's something about us that is able to stand out and see how things work and exploit what we see, or indeed extract the laws of nature. And it's quite interesting. You think of Robert Boyle, he was quite an irritable chap, and always the experiments were failing. He said there was casual breakage of glass. And I've always imagined there's two things going on in his laboratory. There's him watching the gas halve its volume when he doubled the pressure, and then his basically breathing very fast and very angrily because the glass has broken again. But of course, when he's breathing fast, how does he breathe? He increases the volume of his chest, and then in order to reduce the pressure, so the air comes into his chest, and then he breathes out. So you can see how his relationship to his own law is both one of being embraced by it, panting and getting cross because the experiments were not working well, and somebody standing back and seeing how things hold together, and then using them as we have used with all our technology to enhance our agency. Our ability to do that, our ability to stand outside of the world in this kind of way, is something that's not confined to science, although it's beautifully expressed in science. It's about the very nature of human consciousness, and perhaps that's something we could explore, but I've gone on quite at length. You can see it's something I feel quite passionately about.
You don't think that behind the natural laws there is some sort of some form of intelligence, something we can't grasp with our mind, but there is some sort of a grand design behind all these natural laws? It's a little bit like say there is a river which is flowing in every direction. There is sometimes faster, sometimes slower, and you do have a free will, but your free will is to swim with the flow or against the flow.
The first is I do genuinely feel that the idea of a law of nature is a secular echo of the notion of a lawgiver, that basically the world was created and it was shaped in such a way as to be not chaotic but ordered in a way that enabled us to live. So there is the idea behind laws, the notion of a lawgiver. But of course, for science, there isn't the idea of the lawgiver, but there's still a residual notion that the laws have some kind of legislative power, that they direct the course of events as if from the outside. And my argument is we should give up on the notion of laws of nature, by all means talk about the habits of nature, the patterns of its behavior, but those habits are not, as it were, imposed on nature, they are intrinsic to nature. What makes them seem outside is the fact we can then extract from those habits our idea of the way things go, which is most beautifully summarized in the so-called laws of science. But there was something else you said.
About the river and the free will, to swim with or against.
It's almost like the jailer saying, you are free to do whatever you're told to do. And you think, well, no, hang on. And it seems to me that, for example, if you take somebody paddling upstream, yes, they're still using the laws of nature, but actually, I mean, they're exploiting the laws of nature. Action and reaction are equal and opposite. That's how the paddle pushes against the water and shoves you upstream. And if you think of voluntary action, it's about paddling upstream, using technology, using an understanding of how things work. I think that as opposed to simply being like a leaf, being swept downstream. Does that persuade you? Because I'd like you to press me as hard as you want to on that, because it's a sort of central thought for any defense of free will.
I do think that there are trends and tendencies, and you're either part of it, or you go along or you go against. The only element which is missing, in my view, is that you play a role in it. You're part of the river anyway. So there is a tiny interaction with whether the river goes a little bit more to the right or a little bit more to the left.
I have two responses to that. One is, first of all, when we, as it were, exploit the laws of nature, we utilize other laws of nature in order to exploit them. So I've identified action and reaction are equal and opposite. So I paddle, push the paddle backwards, and it pushes me forward so I can go against the stream, basically paddling against a current. And that's what John Stuart Mill beautifully described in a posthumous essay called On Nature. But I couldn't agree with you more. There is absolutely a transcendental element. And who is the transcendental element? For me, it's not a god. It's the conscious subject, the human agent. We are transcendental in the sense we sort of stand outside of things. Just to go back to something I referred to earlier, which was intentionality. For example, I am aware of you because I'm interacting with you, but actually I am still at a distance from you. And what's more, I am aware of that distance. In other words, my consciousness has an aboutness that has you as its object. And that distance creates, as it were, the transcendence that enables us to be agents. I mean, one aspect of that is possibility. I mean, most of our actions are led by the idea of possibility. So you and I meeting today haven't been a reaction, as it were. We haven't been propelled. You've kindly sent me an invitation raising the possibility that we might have a conversation. And actions are about entertaining and fulfilling possibilities, which are another development of intentionality. The possibilities we entertain are about things that are not yet the case. In nature, there's a causal chain. Basically, event A causes event B, causes event C. When I'm deciding, welcoming your invitation, I'm thinking, gosh, that would be great. Let's have that conversation. Well, it's now what is driving my behavior, let's say a week ago, is the idea of a future possibility. In other words, it's the future then, as it were, that shapes, defines, and justifies my action. I'm not being pushed from behind.
A lot of our readership, they look for confirmation of certain philosophical stance in science, right? And what does physics say about this? Oh, the quantum physics is now more on the side of idealism. Do you believe that at least at some point science could prove or disprove certain philosophical assumptions? Either way.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems to me that we needn't be too overwhelmed by the metaphysical contribution of physics. It's in a total mess. If you look at the interpretations of quantum mechanics, they are bonkers, most of them. And outside of science, they wouldn't have been taken seriously. I mean, if you think counting the number of angels dancing on a pin is bonkers, just think about some interpretations of quantum mechanics. The reason we take them seriously is we're incredibly and appropriately grateful to science. Scientists make extraordinarily precise predictions, even within quantum mechanics, and as a result of science, we have had extraordinary technologies. Here am I. I can talk to you miles and miles away. I don't even have to shout. I mean, maybe raise my voice. And, thank you, quantum mechanics, for the mobile phones and for the radio and all these things. So we feel incredibly grateful to science for delivering all sorts of things. And we think, gosh, if it's delivered this kind of stuff, it must have access to truths that go beyond the truths of everyday life. But actually, there are problems. Once you start taking physics seriously as metaphysics, you do run a problem of interpretations, and as I say, there are bonkers interpretations and so on. There are problems with the fact that the two most powerful theories in science, general theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, are actually incompatible. So in a way, to look to science for metaphysics is to mistake our existential obligations to science for the demonstration that science is a very privileged access to fundamental truth. And I don't think that's the case. It's also the fact that there are a multiplicity of sciences, and the special sciences, neuroscience we've been talking about, biology and so on, it's impossible to derive them from fundamental science. There's a nice quote from Richard Feynman. He said, supposing all the knowledge we had was lost, and the Earth went up in flames, and a Martian landed, could we leave one note that would tell the Martian exactly what is the most fundamental truth about this Earth they've landed on? And he said the fundamental truth is everything is made of atoms. And that sounds, And then remember that the notion of atoms is fallen apart. Atoms are no longer indivisible, the subatomic particles. Worse still, they no longer have a location, entanglement and so on and so forth. So I think if you were turning to physics for your metaphysics, you'd be ending in a sort of, shrubbery of a total mess. And I think that's quite important. But the other thing is, how did we arrive at physics? How did we arrive at science? Well, what's central to science is measurement. And what do we do when we make a measurement? We actually impoverish the world. Supposing I tell you there's an object that's 2 feet wide and an aperture that's 3 feet wide. With total confidence, you can tell me that this object can go through the aperture. But you haven't the faintest idea what the object and the aperture are. So you can see how you can do an awful lot of prediction, calculation, and so on without any knowledge of what it is that you're talking about. In fact, measurement sets aside most of the contents of the world. All those things that are described as secondary quality, experiences, color, and so on and so forth. So science becomes great through having an utterly impoverished view of what is there.
You are rather an exception with that.
It's true. It's a bit like neuroscience. You might like this, but there was a fantastic dialogue between Chekhov and Tolstoy. Tolstoy was going on and on and on about the virtues of peasants. And Chekhov said, for God's sake, don't tell me about the virtues of peasants. I was brought up amongst them, and I can tell you, dot, 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 dot. And I've always felt the same when people say neuroscience is going to explain this and explain that and so on and so forth. We'll have a neuroscience of music and so on. I was 30 years doing neuroscience research, and we made some small incremental improvements. Nothing cut any metaphysical ice or explain what music was. So I feel that as a scientist, I'm very, very aware of the limitations of science and how the world of the scientist is inevitably an impoverished world, even though the products of science have immensely enriched our world. Thank you, science.
So you would say that metaphysics informs science and not other way around?
Well, there is an implicit metaphysics. You're probably right, although typically what metaphysical baggage scientists bring to their practice, I think it's methodology rather than metaphysics they bring to their practice. They build on what their predecessors have done. So you build your Large Hadron Collider in order to see, what happens when particles collide at very high energy and so on. But I don't think there is an implicit metaphysics in that. Unfortunately, people then feel the metaphysics comes out of that. So the discovery that there's entanglement between elementary particles is supposed to show that actually there is a ghost in the atom, that mind is present among, even at the most fundamental level, etc., etc. In other words, they feel there are metaphysical conclusions to be drawn from science, rather than, as it were, metaphysical baggage being brought to the scientific enterprise by scientists.
Take objectivity principle, for example. That's a metaphysical assumption, right? And that the world is essentially matter. Yeah, okay, you can say the world is essentially energy, right, or mind, or whatever. That's also a metaphysical assumption, and you run with it. Of course, it affects different sciences differently, but you still have to make these assumptions, I think, to some extent.
You're right, and the very notion of objectivity seems to privilege matter, doesn't it? Because the idea of an object is closer to a rock, say, than a mist or a thought. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. It does seem to privilege objects as bits of matter. But you could argue that that privileging is an essential consequence of trying to arrive at consensus. In other words, we need to have, say, if you and I are going to argue about a table, you and I can say, oh, it's a lovely table. You can say, oh, it's a grotty table. But you and I can't argue about whether it's 2 foot by 4 foot, that much. And so if we treat it as a piece of matter, then clearly one of us is right. If you say it's 2 foot by 3 foot and I say it's 2 foot by 4 foot, one of us is clearly wrong. There's no question of, oh, well, it all depends on how you see it and so on. So in many ways, that the reduction of what is out there to material objects is very much caught up in the notion of objective measurements. I have no problem about the notion of objectivity. It's just that the objective covers a particular territory. I mean, I don't think one can be terribly objective about statecraft or appropriate economic strategies, etc. One can be objective when it comes to deciding that insulin is very good for patients with diabetes.
Where do you think science should proceed? Because currently we are in a reductionist path and cutting things into yet smaller and smaller pieces. We'll end up with strings or whatever. What's the path that science should take? Explaining reality from that point of view, I'm talking about. What is the nature of reality? Should we continue cutting in smaller pieces?
Yes, I mean, there are several points to be made there. First, of course, we must distinguish what you might call the special sciences, like biology or medicine or pathology, from fundamental physics. And clearly, biology, etc., medicine, my own profession. I mean, the advances that have been made in my lifetime as a doctor are just gobsmacking. All the benefits we're now reaping from understanding the genetic basis of disease and what happens downstream of DNA to RNA and beyond, that's fantastic. So I don't think I have any sort of sermons to preach to special science. When it comes to physics, as you may imagine, I'm not deep into the equations, so I speak as someone who is definitely an amateur. But it seems to me that there are two things to say to physicists. One is, first of all, you mustn't, because you're interested at the microscopic or the nanoscopic level, don't think that's the level at which reality is to be found. There is equally real reality at the macroscopic level, at the level of beasts like you and me and tables and chairs, as there is to be discovered at the level of atoms or subatomic particles. Secondly, don't think when you're doing physics, you're doing metaphysics. And thirdly, this is something I've learned from reading the writings of Sabine Hossenfelder, extraordinary writer, I guess you're familiar with her name, who gets very cross with scientists who try and solve their problems by inventing new particles. And that even I, who can't deal with the equation, totally agree with her. Another particle adding to the menagerie of some atomic particles doesn't seem to be a good way forward for physics. But I would be the last person to tell physicists how to build or not build a quantum computer or other things that are way beyond my pay grade.
If we are to explain the reality, we need to bring consciousness into the field of study by science. How do you think we can do that? Because we are stuck with this objectivity and third-person perspective, and you study consciousness, which is a first-person perspective, right?
Very much so. You could never understand consciousness from the standpoint of an unconscious observer. The beautiful paradox that Thomas Nagel talked about of the view from nowhere. Clearly, that is a kind of asymptote of scientific inquiry, but it actually drains the world of consciousness. I guess, thank heavens, we can't, for a moment, arrive at any full account of what we are, you and I, and what the world is, without acknowledging the central role of consciousness in creating our sense of reality. Reality itself is a very difficult term. You'd like to think reality is how things are when they're not disturbed by us, when they're not being observed by us, how they would look in the dark, all that sort of stuff. It's like, what is the sound of a tree falling when there are no ears, etc., etc. So it seems to me that we have a big problem when we're thinking about the very idea of reality. One is of something utterly drained of consciousness, but then it wouldn't be present. Nothing is present except to a conscious subject, however poorly developed that conscious subject is. So it gives you the sense that somehow reality is interactive. And yet that interaction seems to be a kind of contamination of the thing that you're trying to be aware of. You know, when you switch on the light, this thing in the dark now looks blue, and you think, it wasn't blue in the dark, was it? So there is this paradox. And then it gets even worse, because you think, when we think about reality, and we say to somebody, come on, get real, we think of it in existential terms as well. You know, reality is banging your head against a brick wall and it hurts. Or reality is facing all the trouble and toils of life, facing up to limitations and so on. None of those limitations exist in the material world. So reality, it's such a messy term, isn't it? I mean, there's, I don't know if you're familiar, there was a brilliant, if rather sterile philosopher in the 50s and 60s of the last century, J.L. Austin, who looked at the word reality, and he said, actually, reality doesn't have much standing on its own. It's really invoked in reaction to unreality. And he says it's unreality that wears the trousers. So you can say that it's only in the context of charges of unreality that the appeal to reality occurs. But that's a long way, messy way around. I mean, I'm writing a book on it at the moment, and I'm in total mess, as you can see. But it seems to me that we have to be very careful how we use this term, whether we're thinking of it as how things are in themselves, without the disturbance that necessarily comes from them being made present, or how they are experienced, or in what sense they are constrained on what we might do, what we want to do, etc., or indeed how they are understood in opposition to other modes of unreality, like dreams, nightmares, etc.
Are you done with the book almost, or just in the middle of it?
I'm in the middle of it. That's the fattest and most muddled chapter at the moment. Because at the heart of the book is, one of my concerns is that in a scientific account of the world, we fail to acknowledge that there is a major gap between what is, in itself, inverted commas, and that it is. In other words, between the universe and the universe ending up in inverted commas, as when you and I talk about it, or explore it, and so on and so forth. And explicitness, it seems to me, is one of the absolutely central mysteries of the universe. And an awful lot of philosophers have tried to overlook explicitness, how things came to be, not to be merely, but to be that which is the case, that of which there are truths to be said, etc., etc. And back to another of my hobby horses, and tell me to stop, but I'm furious when I see the way the word information is used. There are those who think that the whole universe consists of information, that every causal interaction is a transmission of information. Very famously, John Wheeler, the brilliant physicist, says it, meaning the universe, equals bit. The universe is made up of bits of information. And that, to me, is a perfect example of how we overlook explicitness, how it is that what is becomes, at least in us, as conscious subjects, and perhaps to a lesser extent in other beasts, becomes in us that it is the case. That and the thatosphere are one of the sort of great mysteries. And the whole problem of what is reality is tied up with this notion of, does reality become contaminated by being made explicit, either through perception or through articulation?
Do you think that in order for us to somehow incorporate the whole notion of consciousness into science, the way we do science, is it a matter of methodology? Is it the tools and technology, or is it theory that we need to change?
That's so interesting. First of all, I mean, let's imagine we had no limits to our tools, and I was able to print out the sum total of everything that your brain was doing over a period of 6 months. What would we get? Well, if we did it neuron by neuron, we get 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. I'd have no idea of your life. it would just be a succession of ones and zeros, or patterns of ones and zeros, but nothing that would give me any indication of your life. So I don't think it's the limitations of our current tools to peer into the intracranial darkness. I don't think it's those limitations that stop us making progress. Nor do I think it's a lack of theory. In fact, I think we have an excess of theories. Global workspace in theories, integrated information theories, the notion that perhaps consciousness is located in a particular part of the brain where everything comes together like the claustrum and so on and so forth. I think the fact remains is you cannot get outside of consciousness to see what it is that makes consciousness possible. In other words, whereas, as it were, we're already standing on consciousness in order to start off on that great journey from perception to science. We can't then sort of nip back underneath and, as it were, see what it was that made us conscious. Does that make sense? It's a sort of problem of, in a way, trying to, as it were, by jumping off the springboard, hoping eventually to return to the springboard from which you jump off, or to explain that springboard. Consciousness is, as it were, presupposed in all investigation, whether it's a simple thing like picking up a flower and deciding what it is, or whether it's pressing a button on a large hadron collider. It's presupposed in all these things, as is explicitness. I mean, we talked about consciousness earlier, and I could say, well, consciousness is making things explicit. So I don't think it's lack of theories. I don't think it's a lack of empirical data from adequate instrumentation. I think the whole thing is the idea you can get beneath that in virtue of which you're making an inquiry seems to be self-contradictory.
We will never find out what the nature of reality is, because basically you're saying it's a limitation in itself.
Well, there's some aspects of reality. I mean, I bump into reality all the time. You know, I arrive at the bus stop, I've missed the bus. There's no doubt about that. Or, you know, I'm up all night with the baby and the baby's crying and there's no doubt about it, the baby's crying, and, you know, and I'm really, really worried and all that sort of stuff. I mean, we are absolutely in reality, but at one sort of level. But I think it's the notion that there is a definitive account of reality needs to be looked at very carefully for the reasons I was giving before, that, as it were, we want to try and access things in themselves without disturbing them by our accessing them. There's a lovely metaphor by, I think it's William James, when he was saying trying to think about thought is like basically to switching on a light to see what it's like before the light was switched on. And I think that's the challenge. Does that make sense to you?
It does.
No.
Although, yeah, sometimes I wish things were simpler a little bit. On the other hand, the whole mystery of life would be gone, right?
And I agree with you, because I'm not sincere, because I'm really, really want inquiry, you know, and inquiry is driven by the sense of some kind of revelation. Although, to some extent, I don't really know Borges, one of my favorite writers, but he said that art is the perpetual imminence of a revelation that never comes. And it seems to me that's really true of philosophy, you know, that you're on the verge. You know, I have hundreds of notebooks in which I think, oh, almost there, and, you know, it evaporates. But you need that sense, the sense of possibility, the sense of imminence, of the revelation that never comes. At least it never comes to a secular humanist like me. You know.
Do you think we will ever solve the body-mind problem? Is there a problem at all? Because for idealists, there is no problem. It's all mind anyway. So,
well, I think the problem for the idealists is their bodies. Whereas the problem for the materialist is minds, I think idealists have problems with bodies. I mean, if you think about transcendental idealism with Kant, he said basically space and time don't exist in themselves. They're what he calls forms of sensible intuition. There are ways we shape our experience. And I say, well, hang on a moment. Our experience. I'm having an experience at the moment being in the Athenaeum. And the reason I'm having an experience of being in the Athenaeum, not an experience of being on Mars, is that actually I'm spatially located in the Athenaeum, not spatially located in Mars. So idealists have a problem with space, time, and matter. If they think of everything as merely experience, then there's no justification for having one experience rather than another. Why aren't you not experiencing the Athenaeum if it wasn't for the fact that your material body is not in the Athenaeum? So they both have trouble. And panpsychists have even bigger trouble. And neutral monists who like to see one side is matter and the other side is mind, they just, even worse trouble. Hence my position as a metaphysical, ontological agnostic. And so, in a way, it's not such a miserable position. I mean, there's still a feeling you might have this intuition here and that intuition there, and you can rejoice in the mystery of the world. Wittgenstein once said that philosophy is assembling reminders for a purpose. And I think one of the great purposes of philosophy is to endlessly remind myself and be astonished by what one is. Although I still feel a bit glum at the age of 75, I still haven't discovered what kind of beast I am, and I'll probably die without having made that discovery. And it's a strange thing not to know what one is at the most fundamental level.
I was about to ask you a question about the personhood and self, because key scientists say we are just walking and talking brains, essentially, with a bit of a neural system and some other stuff. Would you agree?
No, I think we have a self. I don't think we have a self that's separate from our bodies. But I mean, the very most famous, as it were, dissolution of the self was by David Hume in his treatise on human nature. And you perhaps remember, he said, when I look inside myself, all I see is sensations of hot and cold and so on. I never see a self. And the answer is, of course not, because you're the one who's looking. It's the self that's doing the looking. And that 3 or 4 sentences in which he describes his position has the word I about 7 or 8 times. You say, well, that's where the self is. I mean, I feel I certainly have a self. It is clearly has sensations, but those sensations are unified. So I'm aware at the moment of the pressure of the seat on my bottom and the books behind me and yourself in front of me and my voice droning on and all that sort of stuff. So I have this unification of my experiences. More to the point, those experiences only make sense in relation to Raymond Tallis of weeks, months, years. And they also only make sense in relation to what Raymond Tallis's future goals are. So I have a temporal depth, which is not, by the way, seen in the brain. A brain at T1 is a brain at T1. So there's an awful lot of self. And then there's the self that comes from the external scaffold. When I go home and I open the door, my wife doesn't call the police thinking there's a stranger. She recognizes me. So I'm acknowledged. I'm Ray. And that creates this sense of what it is to be a self. And I have long-term projects. You have long-term projects. All of these make the self a many-layered thing, compared with the supposed trickle of sensation that was all that David Hume could see.
If you think about historically, both personally and as societies, as civilization, everything changes, but nothing changes fundamentally. We are born, we live, we have experiences, we die. Societies will also go through the same. It's almost like Hegel spiral, where you are repeating the same stuff in different settings. Would you agree with that?
I think the world changes fundamentally. I mean, the last 200 years, life expectancies change, pain and misery expectancy have changed, hunger, fewer and fewer people are hungry despite the horrors we see around us. I think also when you talk about love and so on, it's what we expect of love now. It's quite different. I can't believe that Neanderthals' relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Neanderthal was no different from the relationship between Mrs. Tallis and me. I felt very much that we have a different kind of expectations of each other. And our path through the world is very different from that even of our recent ancestors, 200 years ago or whatever. So I think the world does change. Of course, the terms and conditions which you've referred to don't change. We're born, we live, and we die. Although, again, what happens between those things is different. I've often amused St. Augustine once sort of tried to pull humanity down to sort of, to diss humanity by saying, omnis nascimur intra urinam et feces. I haven't quite got the Latin right, which basically we're all born between urine and feces. And I would say, yes, St. Augustine, But actually, it's only recently we've noted that, and we note it in Latin. And I bet there were not many creatures have the Latin in the way that we do. And I feel that there is a change in humanity. I wouldn't go so far as to say there is progress, except in progress in the amount of suffering before one dies. I mean, I think that is an absolute measure of progress. So that people living longer, less suffering and so on. And I often think of what the past must have been like, not merely in terms of pain, but in terms of itching. People are itching a lot of the time. If you had a urinary infection, it could be a lifetime's, crucifixion. So in that sense, the world has very, very importantly changed. I know I see it a little bit through a medical lens, but there are many other ways in which the world has changed. And I think for the better. Whether we're going to arrive at utopia is another matter altogether, because dystopia seems to be creeping up on the side as well.
Have you ever asked yourself why there is life? What's the purpose to life as such? The emergence of life, the evolution. Is there purpose to it at all?
Gosh, that to me is the fundamental question. I mean, there are three fundamental questions. One is, why is there something rather than nothing?
Exactly. That's my point.
Then the second question is, why did some of that something become animate? And then the third question is, why did some of that animate something become conscious and self-conscious? And I think they're all equally difficult questions. I mean, the idea of a structure that puts itself together, as I did in my mother's womb, with a bit of help from my mother, of course, is extraordinary. I mean, a rock wouldn't take the trouble to put itself together in such a complex way. So the complexity of life, its so-called autopoiesis, putting itself together, it's having, as it were, goals, aims, and intentions. I mean, they didn't come out of the rocks and trees and rocks and volcanoes. So I think it is a profound mystery, and I don't think we've got a good account of the transition. I mean, everybody would say this, nobody would deny it, a good account of the transition from inanimate matter to organic life.
And is there a point to evolution, you think? Apart from self-evident evolve?
It's so accidental, isn't it? So much is accident that in many ways, I can't think there's a point that's been prescribed. I think we find our purposes as conscious beings from within. We have to import our own purposes. I mean, at the very basic level, if I've just dropped something on my toe, I'll have a real sense of purpose. So trying to find, medication to take the pain away. So there's a sense of purpose which is absolutely focused. But as for the broader purpose, trying to discover a purpose that has just been lying there waiting for me to unpack it, unpick it, or reveal it, I think that's unlikely because of the sheer accident. There's a marvelous poem by Aldous Huxley, which he imagines his process of conception. And he said there were a billion spermatozoa that were all swimming towards the egg. And one of them arrived, and that one was me. Meanwhile, I'd elbowed aside a Darwin, a potential Newton, and, a Shakespeare. And the sheer process of accident by which one comes into being makes it so unlikely that one has as it were, a predetermined, pre-prescribed purpose. The purposes I have are those that have come from within my life and my being together with others. But I don't think for a moment that this little blink of time that is the life of Raymond Tallis is actually what the universe has been waiting for impatiently for 13.7 billion years.
You never know. The butterfly, wings flapping, you don't know, what it may cause somewhere else on the other side of the galaxy,
Well, that's true. The trouble is it's likely to, if it's going to be big, it's more likely to be chaotic rather than beneficial. So the fact that there may be a non-linear consequence of my being around isn't reassuring. That non-linear consequence is even less likely to be meaningful than linear consequences.
On the self and our existence here, why do we do this strange thing like art and poetry?
Art has had many functions over the ages, whether it's to please patrons, whether it's to worship God through icons and so on. It may have propaganda purposes, as alas we know from fairly recent history. But there is one other purpose, seems to me, central to art in a secular society, art that hasn't been, as it were, captured for some secondary purpose. And I've described that as repairing the wound in the present tense. I talk about the difficulty of arrival, I have done, is that whatever you do, you never quite arrive at your goal. So you set out on holiday, you get the car to the holiday, you arrive at the holiday place, you unpack, then you go down to the beach with the cricket bat and everything ready to play on the beach, and then up comes the bowler and you whack the ball, and somehow you still haven't quite arrived on holiday because, you know, it's a dynamic process. The present tense is always unfolding, always dynamic, and so on. You never arrive. It's different with a work of art. If you think most obviously of music, one thing it has form, so that form, in a way, is a frozen dynamism. But more importantly, as the music unfolds, it's the journey that matters. No one's pretending for a moment that the point of listening to music is to find out what happens at the end. It's absolutely about here and now, but that here and now is stretched. So the past, the present, and the future together. In some cases, it's made very obvious, as in the case of, say, Wagnerian motifs. If you think about literature, I think one of the most beautiful things said about literature is what E.M. Forster had to say about War and Peace. He said, when you're reading it, and I've read it God knows how many times, you know, you gather together a whole world which consists of bridges and cavalry charges and Natasha weeping and all these things brought together. They're gathered up into a kind of, into some kind of unity. And again, your sort of endlessly trickling away present tense is arrested. The wound in the present tense, where you're always looking away, is to some extent temporarily healed. That's seems to me, one of the central purposes of art and why it gives us such pleasure. As well as all the other reasons that art has that I've mentioned, or the functions that art serves.
I cannot know how you experience, I don't know, taste of chocolate, right? The qualia. You can't transfer that. I cannot know that. You cannot know how I experience the color red. Or maybe I hear music, I see colors, you know, this condition which exists, right? You cannot know it if you don't have it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe art is the way to transfer that, to be able to share it with others so that they can get a glimpse of that experience, because it's not an emotion transfer. There's much more than just emotion when you compose music.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's something about the artistic impulse that really does want to share things. But I don't think the sharing takes place at the level of qualia. I don't, you know, our description of eating chocolate in a book wouldn't in any way import the sensation of chocolate to me if I had no sense of taste or whatever. It's the way that things are structured, I think, that matters very much, and bringing together what we call a collection of otherwise disparate things into a form. I think that's really what art is about, and also to share a world, clearly to share observations. So sharing is very important. Yeah.
Shared consciousness, right? That's also part of it, probably.
It is part of the most fundamental dialogue between human beings, I think, absolutely. And, you know, yes. It's interesting to think about the relationship. I mean, I've published poetry, I've published philosophy, and what is the relationship between poetry and philosophy? And I once heard of a marvelous dialogue. I think it was between Goethe and I think Schiller, but it might have been something else. And Goethe was reporting the fact that somebody said to him, you know, you often write poetry, occasional poetry, you know, when you're asked to write it, you know, for a granddaughter's wedding or whatever. Doesn't that take you away from the big stories, you know, which you should be thinking about? And he said, well, look, if I write a poem and I'm really true to what I write about, if, for example, I describe the song of a blackbird on an evening, then I strike to the heart of creation. And there is that idea of digging deep with one piercing gaze, which poets sometimes seem to achieve absolutely wonderfully. They unpeel your gaze, often with a metaphor, of course. I mean, fantastic metaphor. Yes. I have two favorite metaphors, my two absolute favorite ones. One is from Anthony Burgess, his Malaysian trilogy. It's about a sort of rather junior officer in Malaysia at the end of the British Empire. And everything's going wrong, and the humidity is 100% and the temperature is 90. And he's writing this form, and his sweat keeps dripping on the ink. And Anthony Burgess describes it like a clepsydra, that is, say, a water clock measuring the end of empire. And I think, if only I'd said that, And that's something that cuts to the heart in a most beautiful way. And the second one is from Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. And the consul, I don't know whether you know it at all, but the consul is an alcoholic, and he gets up in the morning and he goes to the cantina for his first glass of whatever the stuff is, I've forgotten. And as he drinks it, he said he's like a burnt-out tree struck by lightning that puts out flowers at each of its tips. I'm not an alcoholic, but I can imagine that's what it must feel like to an alcoholic, having the first drink in the morning. That comes close, I guess, to delivering qualia and to breaking some of the barrier between us. But I don't think we can ever break. I mean, if I had no vision and you were describing red to me, most beautifully, I still wouldn't see red. No.
You really dedicated a lot of time, and you wrote an entire book on time.
I did. It took me 10 years to write.
Wow. Okay. I've sent you the quote. So the ancient poem reads that yesterday is but a memory, tomorrow is only a vision. If today well lived makes every yesterday memory of happiness and every tomorrow a vision of hope. So what time is a sequence, unending, or maybe ending, unending sequence of nows. Now, next now, and yesterday now, and today now. Or is it something else from personal perspective? How do you see time?
It's if you remember, we discussed the self, and the self isn't an instantaneous self. I mean, the Raymond Tallis is making sense of things at the moment, or Natasha is making sense of things at the moment. Basically, it's drawing on a past and pointing towards a future. We human beings, we conscious human beings, have a temporal depth, a temporal width. Nothing would make sense to us except drawing on a multi-layered past and reaching towards an envisaged multi-layered future. So we're not just a succession of nows. We are, or at least any now, as it were, is itself rooted in the past and the present. Tensed time is unique to possibly to human beings, but certainly to animate organisms. Einstein said he regretted the fact that the very concept of tense couldn't be captured by his theory of relativity. Because for that you need a frame of reference, which is a subjective consciousness, which cannot be gathered up in the relativistic, in his theory of relativity.
But is it ontologically independent category?
I think so. Any attempt to define it usually leads in circularity. If time is, someone once said, it's our perception of the sequence of events. I say, well, sequence of events, already you've got time in that definition. You mean temporal sequence of events. So time is our perception of the temporal sequence of events. That's circular. And pretty well any definition of time that captures anything about it is circular. So my own view about time, and this is confidential, is that time is time. Oh, and by the way, it's real. And if you deny its reality, then I will respond in the way that George Moore did when his colleague at Cambridge said that time was unreal. He said, time is unreal, but you just told me you had your breakfast before your lunch. Very odd, isn't it?
That's experiencing time from the point of view of self. And I'm talking about time in the black darkness. If we didn't exist, is it us? Because we exist, there is time. That's what I mean.
I think there's a good question to be had there. And one question says, yes, of course there is, because there was a sequence of events. There was the Big Bang, and then the planets came, and then life came, and then, human beings came. That we do believe there is a sequence. A sequence that took place largely in the absence of conscious beings. I'm not too sure whether that is conclusive. And I've argued with myself about this endlessly, and I end up with the image of the Ouroboros, of basically of the creature whose tail is inside its mouth. I have in the book, one of the reasons I took 10 years to write it was I had a huge trouble about exactly the question you focused on, whether the objective reality of time in the absence of consciousness can be made sense of. And the answer is it must be, and I don't think it can be.